let me introduce you to easily the most disappointing read of my year so far, and that is Vox by Christina Dalcher. Oh boy. For years, I wanted to read this because the premise sounded so interesting. A dystopian world where all of the women are limited to just 100 words per day. If they say anything else, they get electrocuted. Like, that's bleak. Or at least it sounded bleak. The actual execution of this book is nothing short of a disastrous mess that's not dystopian. Like, maybe the first 50 pages are dystopian, but it quickly devolves into just whatever the writer wanted to talk about, and oh boy, was it a mess. You know what this book was? It was Lessons in Chemistry, another book which I don't particularly care for. If you want to check out my review for that, it will be somewhere on my page. But the similarities were there. Unlikable main character, weird obsession with science that isn't properly explained, which, by the way, that is becoming my new pet peeve in books. The level of bad science in this, nauseatingly bad. Like, truly, the more that I think about it, this book was just dystopian lessons in chemistry. Like, the writing was lazy. It managed to portray feminism that felt both dated and reductive. Like, it failed at every aspect of the brief. Our main character, Dr. Jean McClellan, I kind of disliked her. In fact, not even kind of, I disliked her to the point where I was actively rooting against her, which is not what you want in a dystopian series, you know? You're meant to feel like, you know, the main character is someone to hold on to. They're like your ray of hope in this very bleak, sad world. That wasn't the case at all in this. In fact, this world, because it had only recently started to change, everything felt surprisingly chipper. And the number of choices that were made with her character arc that I can't help but wonder. I was so agog. I was like, are we just supposed to dislike her then? Because she's a mother of 4. She's married to a man called Patrick, and she's a mother of 4. But before any of the dystopian stuff comes along, she's been having an extramarital affair with an Italian widower called Lorenzo. And the book is so blasé about that, even though we've been given no indication that she's in like a loveless marriage and needs this outlet. It's just completely unprovoked. Like, it all seems okay with her life at home. But no, she's going to run off, have this affair, gets pregnant from the other man, then even considers running off to another country with this man, completely abandoning her 4 children and her husband in this dystopian world. It's like, oh, this is supposed to be our hero, the person who's going to break down this corrupt system. Like, she's bad. There are multiple instances where she is basically just looking for someone to palm her daughter off onto. She's like, oh, I need someone to look after my daughter. Like, our hero. Our hero who's just like, oh, Sonia, yeah, I'm going to take her out of school because it's not safe for her there, but I don't have anyone to look after her. So yes, the science. If I'm giving this book any credit, the science was not as poorly researched as Lessons in Chemistry. That is way, way worse. But this did have its issues. I found it very strange that you could play like a drinking game of this book where every time they mention Wernicke's area, drink. It's, if you didn't know, it's a part of your brain that's involved with the comprehension of language. But what I found so strange is that they don't once mention Broca's area, which is the corresponding area that's involved in the construction of language. So someone with Wernicke's aphasia, if they have a problem with that part of their brain, they don't understand language, but they can still create it because their Broca's area is working fine, and vice versa. So it was very strange to me that these 2 areas of the brain that I always see as, like, you know, in a couple, the book was so focused on Wernicke's, even though, if we're really going to get into it, you've created this whole system where you're discouraging the women from speaking. You could just work on their Broca's area so that they physically can't speak. They can understand language, but they just can't produce it. You know? I know that's awful, but that's very much a dystopian mindset, you know? Go for broke. Be so horrifically dark. I mean, I never once expected this story to have like the density of brilliance of like The Handmaid's Tale, okay? That's a masterpiece. Atwood's a genius. But the reason that book is so celebrated is because there's so much like moral like baselessness. Like there's no bottom line on what's okay in that book. Everything is so horrifically dark and upsetting, and this really could have taken a leaf from that, because by the ending of this book everything's wrapped up neatly. It's so nice. It's like, oh, and it's like, no, that is not how you dystopian. The end of a dystopia book should be like, oh, okay, I guess this is life now, we just have to tolerate it, you know, it's our new normal. And that's very sad, but that's the whole point. And that's what was really missing from this. There was no real activism. The things that the writer was trying to say, she was really hitting you over the head with them. And that's not, for me, how dystopian politics works. Usually a dystopian book, it exists in the world of allegory. You know, there's like metaphors and things that are meant to represent real world comparisons in a way that's more subtle and thought out. This doesn't have any of that. This is just like, don't men suck? Men are the worst. Women need to be liberated. Ugh. It's like, oh, okay. Like, this felt like something that would have come out in the 60s. It was so tired. And the way that it ridicules men as well. So many insults about men, whether that was that they were short or overweight or they weren't masculine enough. Like, the amount of toxic masculinity in this book, like, I don't think that's the appropriate response to the disenfranchisement of women. Like, oh, let's just be really horrible to men. Like, like when I think of The Power by Naomi Alderman, that book does such a stellar job of clearly deriving inspiration from The Handmaid's Tale, but moving its way in a different direction, carving its own niche into a genre that's already quite oversaturated. And more than anything, it read the zeitgeist of what feminism meant at the time, because feminism is an ever-evolving conversation, and this book needed to pick up on that. The reality that we don't want to see women struggling and being like down and out and abused. We're so past that. The success of The Power comes from the empowerment of its female characters. And even though that's scary and dangerous, it's also uplifting, because you see these women who can do anything. You know, the men are at their mercy, and there is something really gratifying about that. And so this, in comparison, just feels so like it belongs to the world of yesterday, which is not what you want in a dystopian book. It should feel beyond, but at the same time very here and now. The whole time reading this, not only do you dislike Dr. Jean McClellan, but you're also kind of clueless as to why she's important to the plot, because she doesn't really do anything. Like, she's meant to be this smart scientist, but most of the research around the Wernicke's aphasia is either done by Lorenzo, Patrick, her friend. It gets to a point where you're like, what did you do? And she's meant to be a scientist, but she has all these hang-ups, like she won't experiment on animals. The book has this very weird side rhetoric about not experimenting on animals, and she won't use the bone drill even though she needs to when it really matters. She gets someone else to do it. She also can't hack chemistry. It's just like, are you really a scientist? What's going on here? Like, I think you've written in these shortcomings to justify your own lack of knowledge on the subject that you've written about, which, why? Just don't write about it. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, this is a complete skip, and I feel really bad about it because it had the bones of what could have been a really successful, interesting dystopian book, and it completely missed every possible mark. So yeah, it's a no from me.